invite you to open up your Bibles to Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6. And that's where we'll be looking this morning. If you're visiting with us, we are going through the book of Joshua this year. Each first Sunday of the month, we are looking to the book of Joshua. And we're doing so with a particular emphasis on the subject of leadership. The points that we are drawing as we go through are not necessarily the primary lessons that you might take from the author, but they are lessons that focus on that subject, as our theme is leadership. And of course, Joshua is the leader of Israel as he's taking them successfully into the land to conquer. And this morning is maybe one of the most familiar stories in the book of Joshua there in chapter 6. That is the story we just sang about, the story of the city of Jericho. It is the story that really sets the tone for the nature of the conquering, that it is God's work to conquer the land of Canaan, and that they are participants in what God is doing. And I want to think about that they are faithful participants in that, and what characterizes their faithfulness, what characterizes particularly Joshua's faithfulness as he's leading these people to conquer this first city, this walled city of Jericho. And we're going to notice several things as we go through the text. I appreciate Kevin reading a portion of that this morning. We're going to break up the story into three sections. And as we're doing our morning readings on the theme, each of those first Sundays will fall, as we're looking at the theme of Joshua, will fall into that theme and then or that text, and then the other Sundays continue on themes that go along with that. So we read a little bit about that, but we're going to back up to chapter 6 and verse 1, and we're going to begin with these instructions here. In Joshua 6 and verse 1, it says, "Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went in and no one came out. And Yahweh said to Joshua, 'See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors. And you shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it will be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and all the wall of the city will fall down beneath itself, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead.' So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, 'Carry the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Yahweh.' And he said to the people, 'Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go before the ark of Yahweh.' And so it happened that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before Yahweh passed on forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of Yahweh came after them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, 'You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you, shout. Then you shall shout.'" Well, this is the first part that I want to focus on. These instructions, as we have noted before, very peculiar military strategy to go and march around the walls, to do so in silence, to blow trumpets, but the people remain silent, and then to go home. And to do that for 6 days in a row. I want to begin by considering the faithfulness of inaction. That is a peculiar way to talk about faithfulness. Most of the time we're talking about faithfulness about doing something. But I want to talk about the faithfulness that is meted out in not doing something. Here, the natural mode of attacking a city would have involved a lot more activity, would have involved a lot more military strategy, maybe siege weapons and so forth. And so you would have been engaging, and certainly the rest of the world, that's how they would approach a city like this. And here we are doing this very peculiar thing that involves not doing any of that, not even speaking. And after you march in this military procession around the wall, having the unusual next step of nothing. Go home, and then we'll come and do it again tomorrow. Now, I've not been in the military, but I understand from people who have gone through basic training that sometimes the things that your sergeants ask you to do can feel a little monotonous and not particularly profitable. And you don't understand, what is it? Why on earth are they asking? And they have the big picture in mind, and they understand, but they don't always share that with you, right? They just say, put one step in front of the other, learn to march in time, do all of these things, and there are benefits that will come down the road. And you have to have a certain amount of trust or at least an unwillingness to go through the penalties of not doing it, to obey those commands and fall in line and do the things that you're being asked to do. I think that this is not an unusual thing for God to say to his people, I'm not asking you to engage in the normal activity here. In fact, I'm asking you to hold back because I want you to see that this is not you, that it is me. And it's not just that. There are other ways that God asks people to hold back. But think, for instance, of Exodus chapter 14. You remember where the people are crossing the Jordan River there, the Red Sea there. And the language there in Exodus chapter 14, where God has already commanded them to sort of meander around to provoke Pharaoh. And now in verse 13, it says, Moses says to the people, after they have cried out, and they've said, what have you done to us? He says, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. Yahweh will fight for you, and you will keep silent. There's a lot of similarity there in that language of you just sit there and be quiet. Now, some people might hear all of this, and what they might think is that we could take from this that we don't do anything to deliver ourselves. Can I suggest to you, sitting there quietly and watching the Egyptians approach and wait on God to do something is not doing nothing? That in this case, inaction is actually faithfulness. That is self-control. That is refusing to go do the most natural thing, which is cut and run. Or in the case of Jericho, which is go do something besides just walk around this wall and blow trumpets, which doesn't seem like it's going to do anything good. And so there's a self-control and a diligence and a faithfulness that says, okay, I will do nothing. I will do the nothing that God is commanding me to do, and that will be the obedience. It is a difficult thing to patiently sit and do nothing. This is a thing that as a father, as you are working on things and trying to have your children help, my children learned, and it has become a meme today about helping your father, for instance, work on a car engine. What do? A lot of nothing. And then there's a moment where he says, now hand me the wrench. But if you've gotten bored and you've decided doing nothing is not what you signed up for, and you wanted to do something, you will not be there at the moment that you were supposed to do something. So it involves a lot of faithful nothingness in order that you can be faithful in the moment of action. And so God commands a lot of faithful nothingness in this moment. And I think that's a concept that we need to appreciate. Some other ways that God sort of commanded this faithful nothingness, if you will, over in Leviticus chapter 10, In Leviticus chapter 10, of course, the story of Nadab and Abihu and their irreverence and God striking them dead for their irreverent worship. But he says down in verse 6 that Moses said to Aaron and to his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, so that you will not die, and that he will not become wrathful against all the congregation. But your relatives, the whole house of Israel, shall weep over the burning which Yahweh has brought about. You shall not even go out of the doorway of the tent of meeting, lest you die. For the anointing oil of Yahweh is upon you." And so they did according to the word of Moses. Can you imagine? Here's this moment where every natural instinct is to do something, to participate in the morning. He says, stop. What am I supposed to do? Nothing. Stand there in obedient silence, in obedient affirmation of what God has just done. The amount of self-control. This is not, you say, somebody, if they take away the point, you see Aaron does nothing for his salvation. Well, I mean, in a sense, yes. But understand the radical amount of self-control that is being asked of Aaron. And he says, if you don't do this nothing, you will surely die. And so will all the congregation. So you stand there with self-control and don't do what feels most natural to do. Well, another instance in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and in verse 8. You remember the story of Samuel, who had been commanded back in the story of Saul, who had been commanded back in chapter 10 to wait for Samuel. But it tells us in chapter 13 and verse 8 that he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring near to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offerings. And as soon as he finished the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not entered the favor or entreated the favor of Yahweh, so I forced myself to offer the burnt offering." This is somebody saying, what did you expect me to do? And the implication from Samuel is, I expected you to do nothing. I expected you to wait until I got here. And Saul will be judged for his thought that said, I had to do something. No, you did not. You could have sat and waited. What if the Philistines had come? Then you would have been obedient to the Lord. It would not have mattered. But we often act rather on our instincts. Thomas Sowell says, with regards to making observations about governments, he says the urge to do something often leads to doing something worse than nothing. That is true of a great many people who look out and they see a problem and they see that they wish it wasn't that way. I sympathize. But then they think that it is within their power to do something about it when it is not. So they do something. And what Thomas Sowell is saying is a lot of these people are in positions of power, and all the something they're doing to make sure that we do something about this problem so often makes the problem even worse. But then they'll say, after they've made the problem worse, at least we didn't do nothing. Yeah, but that would have been better. And that is often the case. That is not an infrequent occurrence. As we look to the New Testament and as we look to some of the things that God gives us as churches and as individuals to do, there are places where God says, do not do this, even though the thing seems like an awfully good thing to do. This is the argument of general benevolence, of charity to the whole world, fixing the world. And we press and we point to God's word, and we point to passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul is talking about the collection that he is taking up for those who are suffering the famine in Judea. And he uses, of course, the word saints. And he will use it again, and he will use it again. And somebody then comes along and says, surely you don't think that we should just sit by and do nothing when there are people in the world who are hurting? And I would say, I will do nothing except what God has told me to do. And where he has told me to do nothing, or where he has said nothing, that is what I will do. How could you? Because I follow my God. Because like Jesus, I point to the Father and say, I can do nothing except what I see the Father doing, except what he has commanded me to do. And so I practice the faithful restraint, even though my heart may be tugged. What I know is that God knows better than me. That God knows better than me, that God is more compassionate and more kind and more loving and more just and more wise. And so if he didn't tell me to do that, that must not be the best thing to do. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 14, whoever does not receive you nor heed your words, as you leave that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. What do you do? I get this question sometimes. What do you do when people won't listen? Well, I reckon you move on. What do you mean? What other options do you have? Do you think you have some ability to control them, to make them do what they do not want to do? To make them listen to what they do not want to listen to? You are limited in that capacity. If anybody is unlimited in that capacity, if anybody has that capacity, it's God. But I know that when God deals with men, he speaks the word of truth, and then he lets them make their choices. In Genesis chapter 4, this passage that I think so well illustrates the free will of men, the true free will of men. It says, Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is lying at its door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Do you think that God at this moment thinks, that'll do it? I think I got through to him. I think God in his infinite wisdom knows that he did not. He said all that could be said to get through to him. He has laid out the reality. And now God steps back and he lets Cain make his choices. And his choices are to do the very thing that God warned him not to do, warned him was going to happen, and he goes on to suffer the very consequences of all of that. And you say, and people ask specifically about, why didn't God step in? What did you want him to do? Take away man's ability to make choices? This was the only option. And in fact, sometimes we try to exercise that option, right? We think that we can step in. I'm just going to take away all his choices. You will never have that power ultimately. People will always maintain their choices. You can shut them up and you can shackle them and you can do all sorts of things, and they will still be who they want to be. I think a lot of people feel this way about their children. I know that I do. I mean, when we see our children going in wrong directions, and what we want to do is we want to just make them do what's right. And at some level, especially when they're small, that's part of it, right? You're training and so forth. But at some point, it comes to a place where you say, like God, sin is crouching at the door. I don't know what else to tell you. And I'm going to let you make your choices. And I am going to let you suffer the consequences of those choices. In the story of the prodigal son, that is one of the elements. The son comes and says to his father, "Give me my inheritance." And I think some parents must, if they're being honest with themselves, must look at that and go, "What were you thinking giving him his inheritance?" That's a grown man who's got to make his own decisions. And he lets him have his inheritance. And you say, "Didn't you know that he was going to go waste it?" I think he probably did. I don't think the father in that story is fooled. I don't think he's got the wool put, "Oh, I'm sure he'll grow up and be mature now that I'm giving him responsibility." No, he's probably going to run himself in the ground. And I hate it. But there are no other solutions. And so he allows him to do what he will. He does nothing. And I don't mean nothing. But people will say that, about Matthew 10 and verse 14. So you're just not going to do anything else. What? What remains after we've done all that we can, after we said all that we can? So you just given up? I have not given up on the Lord. And I've not given up on his truth. But my faith is not in people's response to it. Along these lines, a secularist by the name of Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called Anxious Generation. And in it, he is bearing witness to this increased control that parents continue to exercise over their children's lives. And he says, as he's studied this, when we overprotect children, we harm them. Overprotection has several harmful effects. It causes children to approach the world with more fear and less confidence. It deprives them of the thousands of small challenges, risks, adversities that they need to encounter to become strong and resilient adults. And it distorts their understanding of themselves and of the world. One of the things he says in that book is, as he's talking to his peers, that they all laugh about how much more freedom their parents gave them to go and to get scrapes and to fall out of trees, and that they would never let their kids play in the death traps that we grew up playing on in the playgrounds we grew up. And they're laughing about it. And they're saying, we really enjoyed that. But we would never let our kids do that. It's like they just can't stop themselves from being those overprotective parents, that they can't do the thing that requires you to step back and say, I've got to let them learn lessons. And that starts even early on. You let them make mistakes. There's a faithfulness to allowing the process to play out. Guided, protected, yes, but also leaving some room. Along these lines, of course, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 34 comes to mind as we think about faithful in action. Matthew 6 and verse 34 says, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself, and each day has enough trouble of its own." I certainly don't think that this or the preceding verses mean don't do anything. But what it does mean is after you've done all that, stop. Stop. People get to that point and it's not things are still uncertain, so they want to keep doing. Stop. You've said what you can say. You've done what you can do. Now, be not anxious and trust in the Lord. And that is what they're doing here, is they are trusting in God to march around and to go home and believe in God and trust in God that he will do what he says. And we can have that confidence. Well, of course, they were doing something. They were acting. And they were doing it just the way that God had commanded them. Back to Joshua chapter 6 and picking up in verse 11, it says, "So he had the ark of Yahweh taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests carried the ark of Yahweh, and the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Yahweh went on continually and blew the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of Yahweh, and they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. And they did so for 6 days. And then it happened on the seventh day that they rose early at the breaking of dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. It happened that on the 7th time the priest blew the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for Yahweh has given you the city. And the city shall be devoted to destruction. It and all that is in it belongs to Yahweh. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep for yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest as you are devoting them to destruction, you also take some of the things devoted to destruction and make the camp of Israel devoted to destruction and bring trouble on it. The silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to Yahweh. They shall go into the treasury of Yahweh." So the people shouted. The priest blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down beneath itself, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. This is salvation through ritual. There is no practical connection between what they are doing and the outcome. By that I mean that there are people who have, in fact, I think I've told you about this before, posited that somehow the sound waves of the shouting and the trumpets reached some sort of vibration pitch that meshed up just right with the mortar and the stones of the wall, and somehow it came apart and fell down. And that to them is more plausible than that God knocked the walls down. That is not a plausible explanation. God wanted them to know you have nothing, you have physically nothing to do with this. But he had told them to do something physical. Even though, and I think it's purposefully disconnected in practical ways from the outcome, but it still must be done. And like so many other cases, this again is such a common aspect of God's commands to men that he often brings about deliverance through ritual. You go back to Exodus chapter 12, before the crossing of the Red Sea, and you remember that God had given them all these commands leading up to the Passover, leading to the death of the firstborn, instituting the Passover. And he tells them about all these things that they need to do with regards to the meal that they're supposed to eat, and of course the blood that goes on the door, the posts, and the lintel. And it says in verse 28, "Then the sons of Israel went and did so just as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." What delivered them? Well, of course, God's hand delivered them. So did the blood, and so did the meal. It all participated in what delivered them. Can we say that their marching around the walls delivered Jericho into their hands? Yes, we can say that. Because God said that is how you will get Jericho delivered into your hands. They did it, and God delivered through the ritual what he had promised. Of course, in 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 14 is the familiar story of Naaman and the instructions that he was given to go dip in the Jordan. And of course, he's affronted by that. And you remember he changes his mind through the counsel of his servant. And it says in verse 14, "So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean." There are not medicinal properties in the river of Jordan. He is not wrong that this is not the nicest river to be dipping in. That there are nicer places to be going about doing this sort of thing. But that's not the point. Jordan does have spiritual significance. It does have meaning in Israel's history. And it also has some meaning that this man has to humble himself and just do what God says. And so he goes, dips the 7 times, and can you imagine coming up the 7th time? I don't know what's going through Naaman's head the first 5 or 6 times, but he does it. And I know he's got enough confidence or enough ability to rely on God that he's willing to at least do it the 7 times. And he comes up the 7th time. And whatever faith he had up to that point, I guarantee you he's got complete faith then. And he knows who it is who has delivered him from his leprosy. And he did it. He is delivered by dipping in the Jordan 7 times through ritual acts. In Genesis chapter 17, we studied about this in our Bible class this morning in the young adult class. Genesis chapter 17, as God is instituting the ritual of circumcision. He says to Abraham, of all the people he is supposed to be circumcising, he says, a servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Notice who all comes into the circumcision covenant. He says it's for Abraham, and he says, and it's for everybody that comes in. It doesn't matter if they're born in your house, but they're foreigners, they're circumcised. It doesn't matter if it's a servant who's not of your seed, they're circumcised. And anybody who's not is out. I said in our class this morning, you can begin to understand and at least have some sympathy for why people might have thought that people who want to come into the covenant have to be circumcised. This was important. And he says, if you don't do it, you're out. And today people go, the rituals were never important. They sound pretty important. But of course, it's not just the ritual, it's the meaning of the ritual. And that's what was so often missed. I don't think it was missed by Joshua and his generation, but I think it was often missed by Israel. And that is what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 2, as people are trying to go back to circumcision and reinstitute it in Christ. He says in verse 25 of Romans 2, for indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. You can make the ritual meaningless. So if the uncircumcised man observes the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, will he not judge you who through the letter of the law and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. Don't take from that God never cared about circumcision. Boy, you have missed the point if that's what you take from that. But God cared about what circumcision meant. And they had lost that. They had thought it only a physical marker that put them into the family of Abraham. And God said, no, it was always a spiritual marker that I wanted. So when Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 that baptism now saves us, he says, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh. It's not an empty ritual that you go through. But it involves the heart. It is a commitment. It is a covenant that you're entering into. And if you are not entering into that covenant, then the ritual becomes useless. But both are important. And there are congregations and there are leaders who see things going from one side to the other, and they constantly make over adjustments. And they fail to recognize the need for that balance. So, for instance, Leonard was talking about this morning, people see that the Lord's Supper is becoming less meaningful. And so instead of just saying, how do we faithfully teach and impress upon people the meaning of the Lord's Supper, they start saying, what can we do? They start looking to worldly wise decisions for how we can infuse emotional meaning into this thing. Or it can be a problem. And so instead you can say, let's not rush through this. let's make sure to give a man some time to develop some thoughts and help us focus our minds. Let's not get up and read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which they were doing this very thing, and say, it says we're supposed to take the Lord's Supper, let's take it. Read the ritual, do the ritual, and then take it. You're contributing to the problem. Let's think a little deeper than that. And that's what our elders have done with the Lord's Supper, is let's focus on that. Let's give time to that, and let's give attention to that and all the facets that it affects and so forth. That is how we address that problem. Not by overreacting and saying, let's not worry so much about the ritual or the particulars of the ritual, and let's introduce some other elements to the ritual so that we can make it more meaningful. What you do is destroy the ritual at that point, right? That's what you're doing. If they had said 6 times seems excessive, how about 3? Or, this is very boring to say quiet. Let's sing a song. God likes songs. He literally said, be quiet. And so, they had to be faithful to the ritual if they wanted the victory that would come from the ritual. One more point that I'll just make a side point. I've mentioned it before. Numbers chapter 20 and verse 8. When Moses neglected to follow the ritual, when he neglected to speak to the rock as he was commanded and struck it and said, what Moses was doing was not just violating a command of God, but he was breaking connections that God was pointing to. Moses was breaking not just with a command, but with eternal truths and realities that God was communicating. When we engage in rituals, just like they engaged in rituals, they engaged in the building of the tabernacle and the worship of the tabernacle, they were saying true things about eternal realities. And when they violated that, like Leviticus chapter 10, it's not just that they violated some random preference of God. They have stepped away. They have broken with eternal realities that God is communicating. What hubris to say, let's make up our own rituals. We are not the creators of the eternal realities, and therefore we are not the ones who decide what the rituals to communicate those realities are. We submit to His designs in those things, and hopefully we submit also to the meaning behind those designs and learn more and more about Him through those rituals. Well, finally, let's talk about their faithfulness in victory. We already read the commands that were given before they went into the city there, going down to verse 20. In verse 20, it says, now they've devoted to destruction everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. Now, to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all that she has out of there, as you have sworn to her. So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all that she had. And they also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and the gold, the articles of bronze and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of Yahweh. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua preserved alive. And she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them swear an oath at that time, saying, cursed before Yahweh is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of the firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of its youngest son he shall set up its gates. So Yahweh was with Joshua, and the report about him was in all the land. Joshua had told them what to do when they went into the city, and they went into the city, and it says they did just that. Now we already know somebody didn't, but that's not the point right now. Right now the point is that Joshua was very serious about this, and he impressed upon them in every way that he could, do not do this. And the people, you think about it, what are the odds that only one man would take something out? That's rather extraordinary, in fact. This is a people who got it. and they did not take what they were not supposed to take. An additional element is that they had promised to save one of the foreigners, a harlot. It would have been very easy at this point to say, I'm glad she helped us, but she's one of them, and a harlot at that. But they kept their commitments there. This is self-control. In both instances, this is self-control as they go in and they are the conquerors of the city. Victory is all too often, conversely, when people forget God. There is the sad phrase in 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and verse 25. 2 Chronicles 32, beginning verse 24, it says, "In those days Hezekiah became sick to the point of death, and he prayed to Yahweh, and Yahweh spoke to him and gave him a miraculous sign. But Hezekiah gave no return for the benefit he received, because his heart was proud. Therefore, wrath came on him and on Judah and on Jerusalem." There's a quick correction here, and I'm glad of it. But it is striking to me, as much as we say in favor of Hezekiah, the couple of times that he fails, and this is a moment where he fails. God gives him the thing that he's pleading for, and Hezekiah, in an almost out-of-character way, just is not thoughtful about it, does not return the thanks. He got the relief he was looking for, and right on. And too often, this is the way we behave. We get under pressure, we cry out. That's the story of Judges, right? We get under the persecution, we cry out. God gives the deliverance. Whew, now we can go back to what we were doing. And of course, this is what Moses warns of in Deuteronomy chapter 8. As the people are about to go into the land, he says to them that they ought to beware lest they forget Yahweh their God by not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which he was commanding them that day. He says, "Lest you eat and are satisfied and build good houses and live in them, and your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, and your heart becomes lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." This is the time that's critical, when you've actually got the success, to help people remember where the success comes from. This can happen in churches. It can happen in churches from a literal standpoint. As we live in prosperous places, we can become like the church at Laodicea there in Revelation 3 and verse 17, where it tells us that the Lord said to them, "Because you say, 'I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing,' and you do not know that you are wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked." Churches can experience the proverbial success of life, and they can therefore become victim of the same problem that Moses warns about and that Laodicea lives out here. But they can become forgetful of God in other ways as they experience other kinds of success. Back in chapter 2 and verse 2 to the church at Ephesus, he says, "I know your deeds and your toil and your perseverance, that you cannot bear with those who are evil. And you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not. And you found them to be false. And you have perseverance and have endured for my name's sake. And you have also not grown weary. But this I have against you, that you have left your first love." They have neglected the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 2, where he says, "If I have the gift of prophecy, and I know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing." Brethren, I think there is a cause for rejoicing and gladness when we stand in spiritual victories, when we uphold the truth. And even when people walk away because we do, we should not hang our heads that we have stood for the truth. We should not become embittered either. That it does not matter if you win the debate, but you lose your soul for it. That this church has experienced spiritual victories, and we do not want to tarnish them by spiritual losses in other places. We have to hold all the things in our hands at once. And somebody might say, well, have you heard the way they're acting? Have you heard what they've said? Listen, that should not be shocking. If we get into a spiritual battle and we stand for the truth and the other side acts poorly, yeah, that's what you would expect. So we can't. Because we're over here trying to stand on the side of truth. And it's not enough just to win the victory in one way, only to lose it in another. I think there's even other ways as churches experience the victory of growth. And then they begin to think in terms of how do we maintain that number and that size as opposed to how do we continue to be faithful to God. Churches get large and then they start getting worried about not being large. And elders start making foolish decisions instead of faithful decisions so that they can maintain that surface victory as opposed to the true one. I'm thankful that not long after I arrived here, and a great many people left, that the elders didn't start panicking and say, what do we got to do to make adjustments? They said to me, what we're going to do is keep preaching the truth. That's what you got to do. Because you can't let external things take your focus off what the most important thing is. And here, they're coming in, they're getting the land, they've got their first taste of victory, and God says, wait up. You don't get to taste that just yet. That's mine. And they had to pull back and say, you're right. That's the most important thing. The victory is His. And we want to make sure that we recognize that and we act like that no matter what. Well, I think these are some of the lessons that we can learn from the taking of Jericho. We need faithful leaders who make it their constant aim to do what pleases God, whether that is decisive action or decisive inaction. If you're here this morning, though, and you're not a Christian, this is the time for action. And there is a ritual that's involved in that. And it is packed with meaning of heavenly realities. And if you know all about that and you are ready to make that commitment and engage in that ritual cleansing, then we plead with you to do so today. But if you want to know more about that, you'd like to study more, then we'd be delighted to do that with you. But in any case, if you need help this morning drawing near to the God who gives victory, then we invite you to come.